Hey everybody, this is Blake here, and welcome to my review of both Ender's Game and Las Vegas. Now, I for one was thrilled that Ender's Game was finally coming out because it meant that I would not have to sit through that same trailer which seemed to be attached to every theatrical release I'd see for the past 2 months ever again. Seriously, I did not think Ender's Game ever looked bad, but it was forced down my throat to such an extent that by the time it came out, I was just sick of it. I was sick of hearing about it. I had very little to no interest in actually watching it. In fact, I probably would have skipped it if it weren't for my dad wanting to see it. Which is a shame because just based on the quality of the trailer, I figured that Ender's Game would either be a good movie or a movie that was more good than bad at the absolute least. I have not read the books, so that's both a good thing and a bad thing. And the bad thing in that I don't really understand the appeal, whereas I imagine those who have read the books see a great story that could translate very well into film. Sort of like Dune. I haven't read the Dune books either, but I know it has a very large following, and I presume for good reason. But on the other hand, I don't have the same fanboy expectations. I do figure that the people who are going to hate Ender's Game the most are fans of the books. But other than that, though, the plot, the characters, the visuals, they all looked very standard. Competent, but standard. And that's how I'd really describe the movie. It's not bad at all. It doesn't even have any glaring flaws. But throughout the film, I just kept thinking it was very unexceptional. It's doing everything well enough to be watchable, but there's very little about it that's getting me thoroughly excited. I was very detached throughout my viewing experience, and well, let me start with what I did really like. I thought the character of Ender was really well realized. I like that he has his very noticeable talents, and that he is a genius when it comes to devising battle strategies, and he seems to handle himself under pressure very well, and he has character strengths that are very admirable. He seems to want to make friends more than enemies, and he's humble in many ways, even though he does also have an ego. But he also has some noticeable flaws. He is very afraid that he's going to be like his brother, who had some very violent tendencies, and that fear is very reoccurring throughout the bulk of the film. He'll have moments where he freaks out and accidentally hurts somebody really badly, and it shakes his faith in himself. And you also never forget that he is a kid, and that as talented as he is he's still developing as a person, and you see that throughout the entire film, and that's a very difficult thing to pull off. And that just really made me care for the character, and I thought the actor did a great job at, just portraying all of these different emotions, these various conflicting emotions. But on the other hand, I felt it really failed when it came to the supporting cast. A lot of these characters' motives just never really felt fleshed out. I did not understand where a lot of these people were coming from, and I felt this really came into play when it came to the people who worked under Ender. Now, I am presuming that this film was fairly faithful to the novel because it suffers from a lot of the flaws which plague faithful adaptations of the novels, and that there's just not as much time to flesh out these characters or their relationships. One of the biggest flaws I had, or one of the biggest problems I had, was this character named Bernard. He's introduced as kind of a bully, and Ender makes a fool out of him, but then for absolutely no reason, Ender chooses him to be one of his crew members, and you don't understand why. I'm presuming it makes a lot more sense in the book. But the problem with the Ender's Game is the way it's structured probably worked really well in the source material, but it just doesn't work well in a movie format. So he starts off where he goes into a battle class. He meets some people who will become his friends, then other people who will become his enemies, and but just as you feel like you're getting to know them and these relationships are actually becoming rather interesting, he gets promoted to I think he goes to commanding school, and then he starts meeting other characters, some who will become his friends, some who will become his enemies, but once again, just as these relationships are actually starting to form, he gets promoted again, and then after that he gets various characters whom he had met in the previous scenes back to work under him, but none of these relationships really mattered. Was the girl from True Grit supposed to be his love interest? She's in the movie quite a bit, but usually it's just for battle scenes. In terms of their relationship, I wasn't really sure what they were going for, or the whole thing with his siblings. Now, apparently, I've heard that his siblings play a larger role in the book, but they're barely here. But at the same time, his sister primarily is supposed to be such an important character to just Ender, that it's just odd that he keeps referencing her even though she doesn't really play a big role within the story. So that was definitely a problem, and once again I feel that if this was a novel I could see all of these relationships and these characters forming naturally and providing the meat of the material, whereas they're just trying to condense so much of that material for a movie format and it just doesn't work. Everything seems undercooked. In terms of its visuals, they were fine. I had no problem with the CGI itself. These days I'm more interested in the design more than the effects, in that the design is, for example, a drawing, and a drawing that has a bland drawing that's still competent is just still going to be bland. You're not going to be all that impressed. Whereas filling that design in with CGI is the equivalent of coloring the drawing in, and if it's done really well, then if you have a great drawing that's colored in really well, it's going to be a great masterpiece. Whereas if it's colored in poorly, aka if they have not a whole lot of resources in regards to the CGI, it's still going to be a great drawing, and I'll respect the design more than I'll dislike the faulty coloring. Or if it's a bland drawing and it's colored in really well, that's not going to save it from being a bland drawing. Well, to me, Ender's Game was a bland drawing that was colored in very well, and I hope I'm not being nonsensical in how I explain my feelings there. The designs could have been cool, but I felt the director did a poor job at filming them. Not that the action scenes were ever incomprehensible, but it always seemed like when he needed to use more wide shots so we can get a view of everything, he preferred using medium shots or close-ups. But then whenever he needed to use medium shots or close-ups of these special effects, he'd use wide shots, so we don't really get a good look at what these various ships in the background look like. So for all I know, they could have been awesome in terms of their design, but the director didn't show that off enough. But the action was fine. Nothing exceptional, but at the same time, there was never any major flaw within the effects, so I guess good job. The pacing is probably the film's most consistent flaw. At first, I was really into it during the first half, flaws and all, but it seemed like during the second half I got really concerned that Ender's Game was much more about build-up than payoff. I kept thinking all the way up until the third act that, is Ender's Game seriously only existing to set up the story for Ender's Game 2? I shit you not, it seemed like the entire movie is just Ender training. Now, there is a justification for this, and I actually will admit that I thought the twist was really well done, but that didn't stop what had preceded it from being awkwardly paced. I started getting bored at times. I started getting tired, and even though there's a justification for that, it doesn't stop me from getting bored and tired at times. And after the twist, there's like an epilogue scene, which I thought was just, I don't know, really clumsily handled. It seemed like it was both rushed, yet at the same time it was going on for too long. I figure it would be a lot more powerful in the books, but the way this movie ends I thought was really unsatisfying. But that was just me. I can't really talk too much about that without spoiling the ending, so I won't. But as a whole, I just thought Ender's Game was standard. It was okay. It's not good enough to warrant a viewing from people who had no interest in seeing the film, but it's not bad enough to dissuade you from watching it in theaters if you had always planned on watching it in theaters. I know that's kind of a lazy summation. Pretty much I'm saying watch it if you felt like watching it from the beginning. But that's just how I feel. It's one of those kinds of movies. It's not going to change any minds, but I think that it's it's worth watching if you wanted to see it from the beginning, and it's not worth watching if you had no interest in seeing it from the beginning. If you were on the fence, I'd say just wait till it comes out on DVD. It's a solid rental for sure, but I don't know if I'd say it's worth paying the money that you have to pay to see it in theaters. So that's enough about Ender's Game. Let's move on to Las Vegas, which I was really looking forward to from the beginning. I just love the cast. I thought the trailers looked really funny, and so I saw it even though the critics' opinions were very lukewarm at best, and I liked it. It's nothing spectacular, but I thought it was consistently amusing. I was concerned that it was just showing off the funny parts in the trailers and that the actual product would be much more serious and dramatic. But it wasn't. I thought it was a comedy throughout the entire film. There's not like an overarching plot. It's just them partying the entire film. But the characters themselves, I thought, were pretty well written, and the actors have a lot of room to have fun and play with their roles, and they themselves really made every scene enjoyable to watch. My favorite was probably Morgan Freeman, but everybody does a good job. I felt that Morgan Freeman and Kevin Kline were the more comedic characters, whereas Robert De Niro and Michael Douglas provided the more dramatic sequences. But I did like how it was never a drama for too long, even though it had some sentimental moments and some sad moments. Usually it's more closer to the end, and it never really hurt the tone of the film, in my opinion. But at the same time, that's really all I could say about Las Vegas. I thought it was very enjoyable, but it's not a heavy-hitting comedy. It's not like, for example, The Hangover, where I thought it was one of the best movies of its years, where I was laughing out loud. Nah, this film was more just I was constantly chuckling. That was it, but that was enough. It was a nice little escape, and I actually preferred it more than Ender's Game, which was more of a bittersweet affair. But here, it was just thoroughly amicable, and I'd recommend you see it as a matinee. Although maybe once again, I'd say at the absolute least, definitely check it out when it comes out on DVD. But I'd even say it was worth seeing in theaters, or at least I thought it was worth seeing in theaters. But that's really all I've got there. So hopefully this video was enjoyable and informative and helped you make your own decisions. I guess I could talk a little bit about the whole controversy surrounding the author of Ender's Game. Apparently he has made his homophobia very public, and a lot of people have called boycotts towards this film just in protest. I don't agree with boycotts, even though I agree even less with his views on homosexuality. I used to be a real hardcore anal fundamentalist during my early teen years, but I was also an asshole in my early teen years, so I'm rather ashamed of that. And even though I strongly oppose homophobia in general, I've always felt that the problem with boycotting is it makes you seem like a hypocrite. Do you boycott the films based on H.P. Lovecraft's works because he was a racist? Or what about the films based on Ian Fleming's works? He was a sexist or a misogynist who thought apparently that lesbianism could be cured by having a lesbian be raped, according to Goldfinger anyway. So do you have problems with those guys, or is it because they were more products of their time, or because they're no longer among the living that you have no problem watching their films? That's actually a decent argument. I don't know if I agree with it, but at least it is a reasonable justification. But I also have to admit that in general these kinds of feelings are more rooted in emotion than logic, and I will admit that I guess I'm a little bit of a hypocrite too, because I cannot watch the films of Roman Polanski. Why? He's a rapist. And actually, even more specifically than that, I didn't totally swear off his films until I was in film school a few years ago, and back when he was arrested, and there was way too many students who felt that he should be released just based on his talents as a filmmaker, and that really disgusted me. So even I've fallen victim to this logic that there are so many holes you could poke within it. But yeah, at the same time, I'm not ashamed of that. So if you feel that same way in regards to the author of Ender's Game's homophobia, I don't blame you, and I don't think the movie's even good enough to really, for me to say you should do so otherwise. It's something that you can't really help. So, there's apparently been a big flame war on the internet about that, between pretty much homophobes versus homosexuals, I think somebody described it as, in terms of the war on IMDb.com. But I understand and respect, well, I guess both sides of the argument. I do not respect homophobes, but that's all I'll say about that. I did not do written reviews of either of these films, but I did do a written review of... what I do a written review of? Halloween Resurrection, the film that killed that franchise, so read that, please. A written review of... I don't even remember anymore. Godzilla Vs Mechagodzilla II, Glimmerman, Event Horizon. I've done quite a few lately, and I plan on doing my next one probably later tonight, which would be a written review of Dora Heita, I believe it's called. I can't pronounce the name right, but it was written by Kurosawa, Masaki Kobayashi, and a few other big Japanese directors of the 60s, and but it wasn't made until the year 2000 by the only writer/director who had survived from that initial group. So read that when that comes out too, and also follow me on Twitter, where I shall release mini reviews and hopefully news on critiquing the critics. So that is all the time I'll spend boring you. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys later.